My daughter wanted to move into my home. When I said no, her husband slammed a solid oak chair right into my head. "You're so selfish," my daughter screamed as blood ran down my cheek. I locked myself in the bathroom, drove to the ER, and sent a text to my lawyer. Phase 1 was complete. An hour later, the police kicked down my front door, hinges and all. Before I get into the rest of the story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever had to stand your ground against family members who underestimated your worth, hit that like button and subscribe. Now let me tell you how a 70-year-old retired contractor ended up bleeding in his own dining room, just to trap the monsters living under his roof. I'm Harrison Caldwell. I'm 70, a widower, and a retired commercial building contractor. I live in Fairfax, Virginia, in a $2.5 million estate that I built from the ground up with my own hands. I don't mean I just wrote the check. I mean this foundation is held together by my sweat. I poured the concrete and framed every wall myself. I laid every inch of the Brazilian cherry hardwood floors. This house was a promise I made to my late wife, Martha. It was our sanctuary. After cancer took her from me a few years ago, the silence in this big house became my only comfort. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, and I was sitting on the wraparound porch, sipping black coffee and looking out over the yard. Martha used to spend hours tending to the hydrangeas, lining the driveway. They always bloomed in these brilliant, massive clusters of blue and violet that reminded me of her every single day. I was soaking in that peace. Then the silence shattered. The roar of an engine ripped through the quiet neighborhood. A black Range Rover tore around the corner, taking the turn way too hard. It was my son-in-law, Derek. He was driving that expensive SUV he bought on credit like he owned the world, even though I knew he was drowning in car payments. He didn't even slow down as he swerved into my driveway. His heavy tires jumped the curb and plowed straight into the flower bed. I watched in horror as that heavy vehicle crushed Martha's beautiful hydrangeas, snapping the stems and grinding the delicate petals into the black dirt. He slammed on the brakes, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the edge of my lawn. I stood up, gripping my coffee mug tight. The blatant disrespect made my blood boil. But before I could say a word, the passenger door flew open. My daughter, Rachel, stepped out. She looked completely unapologetic. She didn't even glance at the ruined flowers. She just walked straight up the porch steps, designer sunglasses perched on her head, holding an iced coffee. No good morning, no how are you. She just pulled her phone out of her designer purse and walked right past me. Right behind her, Derek hopped out of the driver's seat. He popped the trunk and started hauling out massive, heavy suitcases. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 oversized bags. He dragged them onto the porch without a care, huffing and puffing, completely ignoring the muddy tracks his expensive loafers were leaving on my pristine hardwood. I stood there, staring at the mountain of luggage. "What is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though a storm was raging inside me. Rachel turned, sighing as if my question was an incredible inconvenience. "Our landlord sold the place we were renting, Dad," she said in a completely flat tone. "The new owners want to renovate, so they didn't renew our lease. We have nowhere else to go. We're moving in with you." It was a statement, not a request. No phone call the night before. No polite communication to ask if her grieving 70-year-old father minded his quiet life being interrupted. It was a complete, sudden invasion. I looked at Derek, who was struggling to pull the 5th suitcase up the porch steps. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He just grunted and shoved the bag forward. "No," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was final. Rachel blinked, her perfect composure faltering for a split second. "I'm sorry, I said no," I repeated, standing tall in front of the door, blocking their path. "You aren't moving in. This is my home. You can't just show up with your whole life packed in bags and expect me to open the door. You should have called first. You should have asked. And even if you had asked, the answer would still be no." Rachel's face turned bright red, filled with rage. "Dad, are you serious? We literally have nowhere to go. We are your family. You live alone in a 5-bedroom mansion. Since you have all this extra space, It doesn't make sense for us to go somewhere else and pay high rent. To me, this isn't extra space, Rachel, I replied, fighting the urge to raise my voice. This is my home, the home your mother and I built together. I like my peace. I like my routine. I'm not turning my sanctuary into a boarding house for the two of you. Derek let go of his suitcase handle. He puffed out his chest and stepped forward, closing the gap between us. He was a young man, taller than me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. But I'd spent 40 years on commercial construction sites, dealing with men twice his size and 10 times as tough. I didn't budge. Are you kidding me, Harrison? Derek sneered, his voice dripping with malice. You're a 70-year-old guy living alone in a mansion you don't even use. You're just sitting here doing nothing. Don't be so selfish. We need a place to live. Selfish. I looked at this boy, this arrogant kid driving a car he could barely afford, standing on a porch I built with my own 2 hands, calling me selfish. I worked 70 hours a week for 40 years to live like this. I paid cash for every brick and beam. I paid for Rachel's entire Ivy League tuition so she wouldn't start her life in debt. I paid for the lavish wedding you both insisted on. And now you destroy my late wife's garden and come to my door calling me selfish. Derek glared at me, his face turning a dark shade of red. He grabbed the heaviest suitcase and hauled it up. Instead of lifting it over the threshold, he intentionally slammed it down onto the Brazilian cherry hardwood of the entryway. The heavy metal wheels and hard plastic shell hit the wood with a sickening crack. I winced as that sound echoed through the quiet house. I didn't even need to look to know he'd just left a deep, permanent gouge in the floor I'd installed and polished myself. He did it on purpose. It was a power move, a pathetic act of destruction to show me he didn't respect me or anything I cherished. Oops, Derek said, a vicious, mocking smirk spreading across his face. Slipped. My hands tightened into fists. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. Every instinct I'd honed over decades of hard labor was telling me to grab him by his expensive collar and throw him off my property. I wanted to drag him down the steps and toss him right into the mud he'd made of my lawn. I walked straight up to Derek, my face just inches from his. Pick that bag up, I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet growl. Pick it up, turn around, and get off my property, or I'm calling the police to have you arrested for trespassing. Derek chuckled mockingly, but I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He realized I wasn't the weak, frail old man he thought I was. But before he could react, the situation shifted. Rachel pushed Derek aside. That cold, entitled attitude vanished. Her face crumbled, her eyes suddenly filling with desperate tears. She knelt right there on the scratched hardwood floor, gripping my hands, so hard it hurt. Dad, please, she sobbed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, breathless panic. Please, you don't understand. You have to let us stay. If you don't let us in, they're going to end Derek. The words hit me like a physical blow. My anger vanished, replaced by a sudden cold shock. I froze, looking down at my crying daughter. The tears looked real. The fear in her voice sounded genuine. I looked at Rachel, then at Derek, who had turned incredibly pale and looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The mention of a life-threatening situation paralyzed me. My brain raced. Who would want to harm him? What kind of trouble did they bring to my doorstep? Despite their rudeness, despite the ruined flowers and the gouged floors, she was still my daughter. Martha's dying wish was for me to protect her. In that moment of hesitation, a father's instinct overrode a man's pride. I didn't know it then, but agreeing to let them in was the biggest mistake of my life. I was letting the enemy through my gates. I stepped back and let go of her hands. Derek pushed past me, dragging the heavy luggage over the threshold. The hard wheels scraped against the cherry wood, leaving a trail of scratches. Rachel followed without a word, not a single thank you. She just headed straight for the kitchen, not looking back, dropping her expensive purse on the granite island. I had to close the door. The click of the lock sounded like the iron gate of a prison. I followed them into the dining room, where a custom solid oak table, the one Martha and I picked out together, sat in the center. Derek stood by it, hands on his hips, looking around with raw entitlement. He didn't look like a man who feared for his life at all. "You have so much space," Derek muttered. He kicked the leg of the oak table hard with his leather loafers. "This makes no sense. You're a 70-year-old man living alone in a 5-bedroom mansion. Don't be so selfish. We have just as much right to be here as you do." My jaw tightened. I took a deliberate step toward him. "Never kick my furniture," I said, my voice dangerously low. "And never call me selfish in a house paid for by the sweat off my back." I paid $200,000 in cash for Rachel's Ivy League degree. I wrote a $100,000 check for the lavish wedding you two insisted on. I gave you every head start a father could give. Derek sneered, crossing his arms. "Oh, here we go. The great story of the hard-working contractor." He rolled his eyes, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "We get it, Harrison. You worked with your hands. You have dirt under your fingernails. But the world has changed. Blue-collar money doesn't buy class, and clearly it doesn't buy empathy. We're talking about my life right now." I turned to Rachel. She was standing by the fridge, letting her husband talk to me like I was a stray dog. "If your life is in danger," I said, suppressing my rage, "then tell me exactly who is threatening you. Who wants to hurt you, Derek?" Rachel stepped forward. Her face was twisted into a mask of desperate sadness. "It's his tech startup, Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "The launch failed. Investors pulled out, and Derek had to take a bridge loan to keep the servers running. We owe $50,000 to an aggressive private lender. They aren't like normal bankers. They hire dangerous people. They said if we don't pay it back by the end of the month, they're going to make an example of Derek." I stared at her, my brain sorting through the logic. I'd dealt with banks and financiers for 40 years. Private lenders, even aggressive ones, don't threaten to end lives over a $50,000 loan. They file lawsuits. They seize assets. They destroy credit scores. They don't send people to do harm. The math didn't add up. But I looked at her pale face, and Martha's request for me to look after our daughter echoed in my mind. Even with the slightest chance she was in danger, I couldn't turn her away. "Fine," I said, pulling my hand away from hers. "You can stay, but you follow my rules." Rachel breathed a sigh of relief, but I held up a hand to stop her. "You have 6 months," I declared firmly. "Not a day more. You use this time to pay off this supposed debt and find a new place. And Derek, you're getting a job. Not some tech startup, not at some gimmicks. A real job. Finally, my private home office at the end of the hallway is strictly off limits to both of you. You are not to enter it for any reason." Derek smirked, a cocky curve of his lips that showed he had no intention of following my rules. "No problem, boss," he mocked with a sneer. 6 months? Don't worry, we'll be out of your precious place soon enough." They grabbed their luggage and went upstairs, leaving me alone in the dining room. I looked down at the scratch on the hardwood floor, a sinking feeling rising in my stomach. Against my better judgment, I'd opened my doors to them. I'd surrendered my peace. That night, the house felt heavy, oppressive, like the thick air before a storm. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling. Her story played over and over in my head. $50,000. Private lenders. Danger. It was a poorly crafted lie, and my gut was screaming that I was missing a massive piece of the puzzle. By 3 a.m., I still couldn't sleep. My throat was dry, so I got out of bed to get a glass of cold water. I didn't turn on the hallway lights. I knew every inch of this house with my eyes closed, because the very walls I was walking past were framed by my own hands. As I moved silently down the carpeted hallway, I noticed a faint red light pulsing near the baseboard ahead. I stopped, pressing my back against the wall, holding my breath. A few yards away, bathed in pale moonlight, stood Derek. He was standing outside my master bedroom's closed door. He held a digital laser measurer, the kind contractors use to get room dimensions. He pressed the button, and a sharp red beam shot across the floor, straight into the gap under my door. He checked the digital reading, muttered something under his breath, and then typed a note into his phone. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Derek jumped, nearly dropping the laser measurer. He turned around, his eyes wide with shock. He quickly hid the device behind his back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Oh, Harrison," he stammered, the arrogant tone replaced by a nervous flurry. "You scared me. I couldn't sleep. I was just measuring the hallway." "Measuring the hallway at 3 a.m.?" I asked, walking slowly toward him. "Yeah," he managed a nervous laugh. "Rachel and I have an old hallway runner from our last place. I was just seeing if it would fit here. You know, to protect your precious floor." I looked at him, stone-faced. I knew for a fact they'd thrown out all their rugs before packing. I saw the empty trash bags on the side of the road at their house last week. Derek was lying to my face. He wasn't measuring for a rug. He was measuring the exact distance from the stairs to my bedroom door. He was calculating how long it would take to get to me in the dark. "Is that so?" I said coldly. "Go back to sleep, Derek." He scurried down the hall like a frightened rat. I watched him go, the impact of the realization hitting me. They brought the danger right to my doorstep. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us inside. I stood there staring at the 5 massive suitcases piled in my entryway. The peace of my sanctuary had been shattered, replaced by the sound of my daughter's anxious breathing and my son-in-law's sulking silence. Rachel wiped her face, a look of relief replacing the fear she'd just displayed. Derek didn't say a word of thanks. He just picked up the heaviest piece of luggage, the one he'd smashed into my floor, and started dragging it toward the luxury staircase. The wheels scraped against the polished wood. "Stop right there!" I commanded, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Derek stopped, his foot hovering on the bottom step. He turned slowly, his face etched with irritation. I pointed to the hallway leading to the guest wing. "You aren't going upstairs," I declared firmly. "Upstairs is my private space. You're staying in the guest suite on the ground floor. There's plenty of room for what you brought. This house is going to stay clean, and it's going to stay orderly." Rachel rushed forward, placing a hand on my arm. "Of course, Dad," she whispered quickly. "We'll stay in our own space. We just need a safe place to figure things out." I looked into her eyes. "I love you, Rachel," I said softly. "But I'm not a fool. If someone is really trying to harm Derek over a failed business loan, we need to call the police immediately. We need to file a report and get professional protection." I reached into my pocket for my phone. "No!" Rachel gasped, her voice sharpening with panic. She grabbed my wrist, stopping me. "Don't call the police, Dad. Please. You don't know these people. If we get the police involved, they'll know. They have people everywhere. This will only make things worse. We just need time to lay low and raise the money to pay them back." I examined her face closely. The fear looked real, but the logic was full of holes. Normal hard money lenders don't act like movie mobsters. Yet the pure desperation in her grip made me pause. "Fine," I agreed reluctantly, putting my phone back in my pocket. "But we are setting rules right now. You have exactly 6 months to fix this mess and find a new place. Not a day more. And Derek, you must get a manual labor job immediately. No more fictional tech startups. You are to earn an honest wage until this debt is paid." Derek sighed heavily, rolled his eyes, and adjusted his grip on the luggage. "Yeah, sure. Whatever you say, Harrison," he muttered. He turned and began dragging the luggage toward the guest suite at the end of the hall. I stood alone in the foyer, and the quiet of the house returned. But it felt completely different. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that bred hidden secrets and lingering resentment. I walked into the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and gripped the edge of the counter tight. I'd allowed them into my home out of a father's instinct to protect his child, but my gut was screaming that I had just made a catastrophic mistake. The rest of the day passed in a tense blur. They stayed hidden in the guest room, unpacking, talking in rushed whispers. I stayed in my study, a large room at the end of the east hallway. It was my private lounge, filled with bookshelves, a heavy mahogany desk, and a large safe containing my important documents. I locked the door and found comfort in the solid click of the deadbolt. When night fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. We finished dinner in near silence. Derek picked at his food, his face buried in his smartphone, completely ignoring basic table manners. Rachel tried to force pleasant conversation, but the words sounded hollow and clearly rehearsed. Every time I looked at Derek, I saw a deep, unearned arrogance, masking what should have been absolute shame. He didn't look like a man hiding from violent creditors. He looked like a spoiled brat, unhappy with his accommodations. I went to bed early, locking my bedroom door out of a new habit. Sleep, however, completely abandoned me. I tossed and turned, the events of the day replaying in my mind. Rachel's sudden tears, the specific threats of harm over a relatively small business debt, Derek's blatant disrespect. The pieces just wouldn't fit together. By 3 a.m., the house was dead silent. I got up for a drink of water. I didn't turn on the hallway lights. I moved silently, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. As I neared the top of the stairs, I noticed a faint red light pulsing near the baseboard of the hallway below. I stopped, back pressed tight against the wall, holding my breath. I crept down the stairs and peeked around the corner. A few yards away, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the window, stood Derek. He was standing outside the closed door of my private study. He held a digital laser measurer in his hand. He pressed the button, and a sharp red beam shot across the floor, straight into the gap under the door. He checked the digital reading, muttered something under his breath, and then quickly typed a note into his phone. Then he aimed the laser at the door hinges and the heavy deadbolt, measuring the precise dimensions of the solid wood frame. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. Derek jumped, nearly dropping the laser measurer. He turned around, his eyes wide with sudden shock. He quickly tucked the device behind his back, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. "Oh, Harrison," he stammered, the arrogant tone replaced by a nervous flurry. "You scared me. I couldn't sleep. I was just measuring the hallway." "Measuring the hallway at 3 a.m.?" I asked, walking toward him slow and deliberate. "Yeah," he said, forcing a dry laugh. "Rachel and I have an old hallway runner from our last place. I was just seeing if it would fit here. You know, to protect your precious floor." I looked at him stone-faced, but I knew one fact clearly. They had thrown out all their rugs before packing. Derek was lying to my face. He wasn't measuring for a rug. He was measuring the exact dimensions of my locked study door. He was calculating what tools he'd need to breach my private space. "Is that so?" I said coldly, my eyes locked on his. "Go back to sleep, Derek." He scurried down the hall like a frightened rat, disappearing into the guest suite. I stood alone in the darkness, a cold realization hitting me with terrifying clarity. They weren't hiding from violent creditors. They were hiding a much darker agenda, and I was their primary target. My peaceful sanctuary had officially become a dangerous war zone. The next morning, the heavy atmosphere in the house was suffocating. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at a cup of black coffee, listening to the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. My thoughts kept circling back to Derek in the dark hallway, his laser measurer pulsing red on my bedroom door. I knew I had to keep my expression unreadable. When Derek finally dragged himself downstairs, he avoided my gaze entirely, grabbed a protein bar, and retreated to the living room. Rachel, however, was acting completely out of character. She floated into the kitchen with a bright, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hummed softly, started pulling pans from the cupboards, and offered to cook me a big breakfast. I politely declined, saying I just needed to grab the morning mail. I walked down the long driveway to the ornate brick mailbox near the street. The crisp Virginia air usually brought me peace, but today it offered no comfort. I opened the heavy metal door and pulled out a stack of letters. Most were standard bills and local ads, but at the bottom of the pile a thick black envelope caught my eye instantly. It was addressed directly to Derek. The return address was printed in striking silver lettering, Apex Funding. My breath hitched. I stood frozen at the edge of the driveway, staring at the ominous envelope. In my 40 years as a commercial contractor, I'd seen many men lose their businesses to bad debt. Apex Funding wasn't a legitimate bank or a standard investment firm. They were notorious hard money lenders, loan sharks, operating in the shadows of the Virginia financial scene. They had deep ties to the criminal underworld, using cold-blooded violence to collect on loans. Derek had lied to me. The money he owed wasn't to some desperate tech investor. he had gotten involved with dangerous people. I shoved the black envelope into my coat pocket and walked back to the house, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. I found Rachel standing at the kitchen sink. She had my orange prescription bottle in her hand, the critical heart medication my cardiologist prescribed to keep my blood pressure stable. Before I could even speak, she casually tossed the entire plastic bottle into the trash. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight with suppressed alarm. "That's my daily prescription." Rachel turned to me, her face beaming with artificial care. "Don't worry about those cheap generics, Dad," she said in a sickeningly sweet tone. "I read up on heart health last night. Those commercial drugs do more harm than good. I bought you something much better." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a sleek, unmarked silver pill case. She opened it and handed me a large, clear capsule filled with fine white powder. "These are high-end imported supplements. They're completely natural and cost me a fortune. I bought them just for you. I want you to be healthy and strong so we can enjoy our time together." I looked down at the capsule resting in my palm. The plastic casing felt cold. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to throw it away. The sudden change in her behavior, the discarded prescription, the mysterious powder, it all painted an incredibly disturbing picture. But I knew I couldn't show my suspicion yet. If I confronted her now, she'd just weave another lie. "Thank you, Rachel," I said, forcing a grateful smile. "That's so thoughtful of you." I raised my hand to my mouth, pretending to toss the capsule to the back of my throat. I took a massive gulp of water from a glass, making an exaggerated swallowing motion. In reality, I deftly slipped the capsule under my tongue. Rachel stared at my throat, eyes fixed on my Adam's apple. When I set the glass down, her shoulders relaxed, and that fake, chilling smile returned to her face. I made an excuse about needing to change clothes to run some morning errands. Once I was safely locked in the bathroom, I spat the intact capsule into a tissue, wrapped it carefully, and stuffed it deep into my pocket. An hour later, I was driving my truck into downtown Fairfax. I parked in front of my primary bank, the institution that held my most important documents, including my property deed and my final will. I walked straight into the manager's office. Sarah, the branch manager I'd known for over 15 years, greeted me with a warm, familiar smile. "Harrison, it's always good to see you." She signaled for me to sit. "I assume you're here about the safety deposit box. I was going to call you, but I thought everything had been resolved." I frowned, gripping the armrests of the leather chair. "Resolved? What do you mean, Sarah?" Her smile faded, replaced by slight confusion. "I'm so sorry I couldn't help Rachel yesterday," she explained gently. "She came in right before closing. She said your mobility was declining, and you needed her to retrieve some important real estate documents from your box. She presented a power of attorney, but unfortunately, it lacked the legal notarized seal. Our policies are very strict on these matters, so I had to turn her away. I assumed she'd gone home to get the document completed." The blood drained from my face. The room seemed to tilt. "I have never drafted a power of attorney, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I have never authorized Rachel to access my box, and my mobility is perfectly fine." Sarah gasped, her professional demeanor shattered by genuine terror. "Harrison, she presented a document with your signature. It looked identical to the one in our files. If you didn't sign that document, then your daughter attempted serious financial fraud against your account." I sat in that cold office, struggling to draw oxygen into my lungs. They weren't just looking for a place to crash. They were actively trying to steal my entire estate. Forged signatures, mob debt, sinister measurements in the hallway. This was a calculated, coordinated attack on my life's work. I instructed Sarah to place a maximum security freeze on all my accounts. I walked out of the bank in a daze, my brain completely numb from the horrifying truth. I climbed into my heavy truck, locked the doors tight, and slowly pulled out the tissue containing the capsule. With my thumbnail, I carefully pried the two halves of the capsule open. I held the open capsule directly under my nose and took a shallow sniff. The smell was nauseating. It didn't smell like vitamins or herbal supplements. It smelled pungent, metallic, and chemical, like some kind of toxic industrial solvent. As the terrible reality finally settled in, my stomach rolled violently. I was living under the same roof as two people actively planning to end my life. They wanted to play a deadly game, but they had severely underestimated the man they were trying to eliminate. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove my truck across the county line to a private toxicology lab in Alexandria. I'd used their services years ago for corporate drug testing on my commercial construction sites. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit reception area and asked to speak directly with the lead toxicologist. I placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter next to the tissue-wrapped capsule. I told him I needed the chemical makeup of the powder inside, and I needed it immediately. He told me an expedited analysis would take a few hours. I sat in the waiting room, drinking horrible vending machine coffee, feeling the cold weight of the betrayal seep deep into my marrow. My own daughter, the girl I taught to ride a bike, the girl I walked down the aisle, she was actively participating in a plot to take my life. 3 agonizing long hours later, the toxicologist called me into his office. His face was grim. He laid a printed report on the desk and looked at me with deep concern. The powder in that capsule wasn't a dietary supplement at all. It was a highly concentrated synthetic compound designed to trigger a massive, rapid spike in blood pressure. If someone of my age and medical history ingested that dosage, it would almost certainly induce a fatal myocardial infarction, a heart attack. To any standard medical examiner, it would look like a perfectly natural tragedy. They weren't trying to slowly poison me. They were trying to execute a precise, untraceable assassination. I thanked the doctor, folded the report into my chest pocket, and walked out to my truck. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a profound, chilling rage. I pulled out my phone and dialed Gregory Holt. Gregory wasn't just my lawyer. He was a former prosecutor and one of the sharpest legal minds in Virginia. We had fought many battles side by side. I told him I needed an emergency meeting. We met in a quiet, dimly lit booth in the back of a local steakhouse. I slid the toxicology report and my notes from the bank across the polished mahogany table. Gregory read the documents carefully, his expression turning colder and harder as the minutes passed. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Harrison," he said, his voice low and full of urgency, "this is attempted murder and felony fraud. We need to call the police right now. We need to have the authorities escort you home and throw them out onto the street." I shook my head. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. "If we call the police now, what exactly will happen, Gregory?" I asked. "Rachel will cry. Derek will play dumb. They'll claim they bought the supplements online and had no idea they were dangerous. They'll claim the forged power of attorney was a misunderstanding, that I verbally agreed to it and just forgot. The police will take a report, but without hard, irrefutable evidence of malicious intent, they won't arrest them tonight." Gregory sighed heavily and leaned forward. "You're right. Without a recorded confession or direct act of violence, a shrewd defense lawyer would twist this into a tragic misunderstanding. But Harrison, you cannot go back to that house. You cannot sleep under the same roof as two people actively planning your murder. We must evict them immediately." "Evict them?" I sneered, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I want them gone today. I want to change the locks and toss their designer bags onto the front lawn." "You cannot do that," Gregory warned, his tone deadly serious. "Under Virginia law, they have lived in your home long enough to establish basic tenant rights. If you change the locks or throw their property out, they will call the police on you and charge you with an illegal self-help eviction. The police will force you to let them back in. To get them out legally, we have to serve them with 30-day notice papers, file an unlawful detainer lawsuit in civil court, and wait for a judge to issue an eviction order. The entire process could take up to 6 months. 6 months? I stared at Gregory, the sheer absurdity of the legal system hitting me. You're telling me I have to live for half a year with my future murderers, while a judge decides if I'm allowed to kick them out of the house I built myself. In those 6 months, they will have access to my food, my water, my daily routine. They will have thousands of opportunities to slip that poison into my life. I will be a prisoner in my own sanctuary, waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. Gregory looked at me with sympathy. The law is designed to protect tenants from malicious landlords, Harrison. It doesn't account for sociopathic family members. If you want them out of that house permanently tonight, without going through the civil eviction process, you need them to be taken away in handcuffs. You need them to be charged with a violent felony. A felony arrest triggers an automatic protective order. That would immediately revoke their rights to the property. But to get a felony arrest, we need absolute, undeniable evidence of an ongoing crime. I looked down at my scarred, calloused hands. These hands had built skyscrapers. These hands had held my daughter when she was too tired to walk. I'd spent a lifetime building and protecting. Now I had to become the predator. I needed to hunt the people living in my guest room. I looked up at Gregory and made my decision. I don't just want to evict them, Gregory. I want to destroy them. I want to see them in federal prison. Get the papers for the restraining order ready. File them the second I give the word. I'm going to get you that undeniable evidence. The sun rose in Fairfax, casting long shadows across my manicured lawn. I hadn't slept a wink since my encounter with Derek in the hallway. My brain was operating with the cold, mechanical precision I usually reserved for complex structural engineering problems. Every creak of the floorboards, every hushed whisper from the guest suite downstairs was a new data point. I needed to understand the true architecture of their lies. I made coffee in absolute silence and walked out to the porch to retrieve the morning mail. The crisp Virginia air usually brought a clear head, but today it felt heavy with the looming dread. I opened the ornate brick mailbox and pulled out a stack of thick envelopes. Flipping through standard utility bills and local ads, my hand suddenly stopped. At the bottom of the stack, nestled among the mail, was a thick black envelope addressed to Derek. The return address, printed in striking silver lettering, sent a chill down my spine. Apex funding. After 40 years in the contracting business, you pick up on a lot of whispers around the job sites. You quickly learn the names of certain financial groups that legitimate business people stay far away from. Summit Capital isn't your typical bank or investment firm. They operate in the darkest shadows of the financial world, notorious for high-stakes lending and deep, dangerous ties to the criminal underworld. They don't send polite payment reminders or make friendly collection calls. They use cold, aggressive tactics to settle their debts. The story Rachel spun about a failing tech startup and a simple business loan was a total fabrication. Derek borrowed money from people who don't just ask for repayment. They dismantle lives. He was in deep with some very bad people. I tucked that ominous envelope into my coat pocket and walked back inside, my mind racing with a dozen terrifying possibilities. When I stepped into the kitchen, Rachel was standing by the marble island. She was acting completely off, drifting around the room with a wide, fake smile that never reached her eyes. She was humming a light tune while pouring a glass of fresh orange juice. Then I watched in disbelief as she reached for my orange prescription bottle. This was the life-saving medication my cardiologist prescribed to keep my blood pressure steady. Without a second of hesitation, Rachel tossed the entire plastic bottle straight into the trash. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight as I fought to keep my panic in check. "That is my daily prescription." Rachel turned, her face beaming with manufactured concern. "Don't worry about those cheap generics, Dad," she said in that sickeningly sweet tone. "I did some research on heart health last night, and those commercial meds do more harm than good. I bought you something better." She pulled a sleek, unmarked silver pill case from her apron pocket, opened it, and handed me a large, clear capsule filled with fine white powder. "These are high-end imported supplements," she continued smoothly. "They're all natural and cost a small fortune. I bought them just for you. I want you healthy and strong so we can enjoy this time together." I looked down at the capsule resting in my palm. The plastic casing felt disturbingly cold against my skin. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to throw it away immediately. Her sudden shift in behavior, the discarded prescriptions, the mysterious white powder, it all painted an incredibly dark picture. But I knew I couldn't expose my suspicions now. If I confronted her, she would just spin another lie, and cover her tracks. "Thank you, Rachel," I said, forcing a grateful, unsuspecting smile. "That is so thoughtful of you." I raised my hand, pretending to toss the capsule deep into my throat, took a large gulp of orange juice, and exaggerated the act of swallowing. In reality, with the desperate sleight of hand of a man fighting for his life, I managed to tuck the capsule under my tongue. Rachel was staring right at my throat. When I put the glass down, her shoulders visibly relaxed, and that fake chilling smile returned to her face. I made an excuse about needing to get dressed to run some morning errands. Once I was safely locked inside the master bathroom, I spat the intact capsule into a tissue, wrapped it carefully, and shoved it deep into my pocket. I needed answers, and I needed to ensure the assets I'd spent a lifetime building were safe. An hour later, I was driving my truck downtown to the main branch of my bank, the place that held my most important financial documents, retirement accounts, and my final will. I headed straight for the branch manager's office. Sarah, a woman I've known and worked with for over 15 years, greeted me with a warm, familiar smile. "Harrison, it's always good to see you," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in the leather chair opposite her mahogany desk. "I assume you're here about the safety deposit box. I meant to call you earlier, but I thought everything was sorted out." I frowned, gripping the armrest tightly. "Sorted out? Sarah, what do you mean?" Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of genuine, mild confusion. "I'm so sorry I couldn't help Rachel yesterday," she explained gently, using her strictly professional tone. "She came in right before closing. She told me your mobility was rapidly declining and that you needed her to retrieve some important real estate documents from your box. She presented a formal power of attorney, but unfortunately it was missing the official notarized seal. Our policy is very strict on that, so I had to turn her away. I assumed she went home to have you finish the paperwork." The color completely drained from my face. The office walls seemed to tilt, and the ambient noise of the bank faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. "I never drafted a power of attorney, Sarah." My voice dropped to a hoarse, breathless whisper. "I never authorized Rachel to touch my box, and my mobility is perfectly fine." Sarah gasped, her professional composure shattered by pure alarm. "Harrison, she presented a legal document with your signature on it. It looked exactly like the signature we have on file. If you didn't sign that, your daughter was attempting to commit serious financial fraud against your accounts." I sat in that sterile office, struggling to pull oxygen into my lungs. They weren't just looking for a place to stay. They were actively trying to steal my entire estate. The forged signature, the debt, the sinister measuring in the hallways. It was a coordinated, deliberate attack on everything I had worked for. I instructed Sarah to place a high-security fraud freeze on all my accounts immediately, and to revoke access for any and all authorized users, regardless of what documents they might produce. I walked out of the bank with my head spinning, completely numb from the terrifying discovery. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine to mask the sound of my ragged breathing. I slowly took out the tissue with Rachel's capsule, using my thumbnail to carefully pry the two halves of the plastic shell apart. I brought the open capsule to my nose and took a shallow sniff. The smell was nauseating. It didn't smell like vitamins or herbal supplements. It smelled harsh, metallic, and chemical, like some toxic industrial solvent. My stomach turned violently as the horrifying reality finally set in. I was living under the same roof as two people actively plotting to end my life. They wanted to play a lethal game, but they had severely underestimated the person they were trying to remove. I didn't go home. Instead, I put the truck in gear and drove across the county to a private toxicology lab I'd used years ago for corporate drug testing. The drive was filled with suffocating anxiety. I parked in the sterile lot and walked through the heavy glass doors into the bright reception area. The facility was filled with the smell of bleach and preservatives, a sharp contrast to the metallic stench that was burning a hole in my pocket. I demanded to speak directly with the head toxicologist, Dr. Harris. When he finally appeared in the lobby, looking exhausted, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I placed a crisp $100 bill on his pristine counter, right next to the tissue containing the capsule. I told him I needed a full chemical analysis of the powder in that shell, and I needed the results immediately. He looked at the cache, then at my unwavering expression, cleared his throat, and agreed to expedite the process. He told me the rush test would take a few agonizing hours. I sat alone in the empty waiting room, staring blankly at the faded beige walls. I bought a cup of bitter coffee from the humming vending machine in the corner, but I couldn't bring myself to take a single sip. My mind was being swallowed by a dark storm of betrayal. This was my own daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike in the driveway, the young woman I'd walked down the aisle, the child I'd spent my life protecting and providing for. She wasn't just a passive bystander in some misguided financial scam. She was an active, willing participant in a calculated plot to end my life. She looked me right in the eyes, wearing a fake, caring smile, and handed me lethal poison while claiming it was a health supplement. The sheer antisocial nature of her deception was impossible to process. I felt a cold, heavy weight sink deep into my bones, extinguishing the last remnants of fatherly love I had for her. She had chosen her path, aligning herself with a ruthless criminal and his dangerous debts. After 3 agonizing hours of silent contemplation, Dr. Harris finally called me into his private office. His face was uncharacteristically grim, his professional detachment replaced by a deep concern. He gestured for me to sit in the metal chair across from his desk and carefully placed a detailed laboratory report between us, tapping the page with his pen. The powder in that capsule isn't a dietary supplement, a vitamin, or anything related to health, he explained in a low, serious voice. It's a highly concentrated synthetic chemical compound specifically designed to trigger a massive, uncontrollable spike in blood pressure. He looked at me, assessing my age and medical history. If someone of your age and medical profile ingested this exact dosage, he said firmly, it would almost certainly induce a sudden, catastrophic cardiac event, a fatal heart attack. Furthermore, this chemical is designed to break down rapidly in the human bloodstream. When a standard medical examiner performs a routine post-mortem, it will look like a completely natural, tragic medical event. They were carrying out a precise, nearly untraceable act. I thanked the doctor, and even though a hurricane of rage was tearing through my chest, my voice remained eerily steady. I carefully folded the official toxicology report and slid it into my breast pocket, along with my notes on the forged bank documents. I walked out of the sterile lab and back to my truck. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a chilling, cold-blooded anger. I pulled out my phone and immediately dialed Gregory Holt's number. When he answered, I skipped the standard pleasantries. I told him I was in a life-or-death situation and needed an emergency in-person meeting right now. An hour later, we met in a quiet, dimly lit booth in the back of an upscale steakhouse downtown. The lunch rush was over, the restaurant was nearly empty, and it was perfect for a discreet conversation. I didn't order food or a drink. I simply reached into my pocket and slid the folded toxicology report across the polished mahogany tabletop. Then I detailed the harrowing morning I just had. I explained about the black envelope from the notorious lending group, Summit Capital. I described the forged power of attorney Rachel had used to try and breach my safe. Finally, I pointed to the lab report, detailing how she had tried to feed me a lethal compound while masquerading as a loving daughter. Gregory read the documents meticulously, his experienced expression hardening into a mask of pure professional outrage with every passing second. He took off his silver reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me. "Harrison," he said, his voice low and incredibly urgent, "this is attempted murder and serious felony financial fraud. We need to call the police, right now. We need to have them escort you back home and throw them out on the street." I shook my head, my jaw clenched. If we call the police now, Rachel will cry. Derek will play the innocent husband. They'll claim they bought the supplements online from an unreliable vendor and had absolutely no idea they were dangerous. The police would just take a basic report. but without hard, irrefutable evidence of their malicious intent, they wouldn't be arrested tonight. Gregory let out a heavy sigh. You're right, he admitted. But Harrison, you cannot go back to that house. We have to file for a formal eviction immediately. Evict them? I let out a bitter, cold laugh. I want to change the locks today and toss their bags onto the lawn. You absolutely cannot do that, Gregory warned. Under state law, they've already established squatters' and tenants' rights. A civil eviction could easily take up to 6 months. 6 months? I stared at him, the terrifying absurdity of the legal system washing over me. I was going to be a helpless prisoner in my own sanctuary, waiting for the executioner to swing the blade. To get them out tonight, you need them taken away in handcuffs for a violent felony, Gregory explained calmly. I looked down at my own scarred, calloused hands on the table. To survive this, I had to become the predator. I'm going back to that house, I stated firmly, and I'm going to get you the irrefutable evidence by tonight. I left the steakhouse with a cold, absolute clarity I hadn't felt since running high-risk construction sites years ago. I drove back to my sprawling estate, constructing the blueprints of the trap in my mind. As I walked through the front door, I forced my facial muscles to relax, crafting the expression of a tired, easygoing father. Rachel was in the kitchen, casually flipping through a magazine. Derek was lounging on my custom sofa, his feet resting disrespectfully on the mahogany coffee table. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the difficult performance ahead. I had to convince them beyond a shadow of a doubt that their vicious, fabricated reality was working perfectly, without a single hitch. I walked into the room, letting out a heavy, exaggerated sigh. "Listen, you two," I said, ensuring my tone sounded exhausted and frustrated. "I know things have been incredibly tense since you arrived. I'm not used to sharing my space, and I know I can be difficult to live with." Rachel looked up, feigning sympathetic concern. "Oh, Dad, you're not difficult at all," she lied smoothly. "We're just so grateful to be here." I nodded, playing the fool to perfection. "Well, I think we all need a little breathing room," I continued. "My old fishing buddy invited me out to the Chesapeake Bay for the weekend. We're going to take his boat out for some deep-sea fishing, just disconnect for a few days and relax. I'm leaving first thing tomorrow morning and won't be back until late Sunday night." The shift in their body language was instantaneous and deeply sickening. Derek actually sat up straight, a spark of genuine excitement flashing in his eyes before he quickly masked it. Rachel rushed over and wrapped her arms around my neck. "That sounds wonderful, Dad," she cooed, planting a fake kiss on my cheek. "You deserve a relaxing vacation. Don't worry about anything here at the house. We'll keep an eye on things." "I'm sure you will," I thought, suppressing the urge to push her away. The rest of that night, I spent packing my fishing gear, waterproof boots, and heavy sweaters into a canvas duffel bag. The next morning, I put on quite a show, loading the truck and waving goodbye to my daughter and son-in-law as they stood on the front porch, playing the part of the grateful children. I pulled out of the driveway and drove off, but I didn't head east toward the coast. Instead, I drove 10 miles to an empty commercial parking lot and waited. I pulled out a burner phone and called an old friend named Jackson. We'd worked together for decades on high-stakes government contracts. Jackson is a former military intelligence officer who now runs an elite private security firm for corporate executives. I'd called him late the night before to explain the gravity of the situation, and he had mobilized his best technical team immediately. 30 minutes later, an unmarked gray utility van pulled into the lot and parked next to my truck. Jackson rolled down his window and handed me a small digital tracker. Before leaving the house, I'd managed to slip a GPS listening device into the lining of Rachel's expensive handbag. We watched the glowing dot blink on the screen. We held our breath for 2 long hours before the tracker finally started moving. Rachel and Derek were leaving the estate, heading toward a high-end commercial district in Fairfax. They were undoubtedly celebrating their newfound freedom, spending money they didn't actually have, all while finalizing plans to ruin me completely. Once they were a few miles out, I signaled Jackson. We drove back to my property in tandem. I bypassed the alarm system with a physical key and led Jackson and his 2 silent technicians inside. We had a narrow 60-minute window to get the job done. The technicians moved with incredible military-grade precision. They didn't carry bulky cameras or obvious wires. Instead, they used tiny, completely inconspicuous everyday objects, standard white USB wall chargers, smoke detectors, digital alarm clocks. Jackson explained that these were cloud-based, professional-grade recording devices. They recorded in high definition, captured crystal-clear audio, and transmitted encrypted feeds directly to a secure server. They didn't even need internal batteries. They drew power directly from the wall outlets. I directed the first tech to the main living room. He quickly swapped out the standard wall plate near the TV for one with dual USB charging ports. It provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire seating area. The second technician moved to the kitchen, replacing the smoke detector on the ceiling with an identical unit containing a micro 360-degree camera. It covered the marble island, the fridge, and the exact spot where Rachel had discarded my essential medication. Finally, I led Jackson down the hall to my private study. This was the most critical location. This was the room Derek had been measuring late at night. Jackson replaced the digital clock on my mahogany desk with a device featuring a hidden lens aimed directly at my heavy steel safe. He then installed auxiliary USB chargers near the doorframe to capture the face of anyone attempting to bypass that heavy wood door. The entire installation took 45 minutes. We left no trace of our presence, not a speck of drywall dust, not a single footprint on the carpet. I locked the front door, feeling a profound shift in power. For the past 3 days, I'd been a helpless victim in my own home, reacting to their lies and constantly looking over my shoulder. Now, I possessed an all-seeing eye they knew nothing about. I shook hands with Jackson in the driveway, thanking him for the flawless execution. I climbed back into my truck and drove to an unassuming motel on the edge of town. I paid in cash, locked the heavy door, and sat on the edge of the stiff mattress. I pulled out my laptop and connected to the secure, encrypted network Jackson had provided. The screen flickered to life, splitting into multiple high-definition video feeds. I could see my living room, my kitchen, and my study with absolute clarity. The audio feed picked up the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I sat in the dim motel light, watching my empty house, waiting for the rats to return to the trap. I wasn't that confused, easygoing father anymore. I wasn't the aging contractor they thought they could easily manipulate and get rid of. The dynamic had shifted fundamentally. They thought they had the whole weekend to carry out their dark agenda without any oversight. They thought they were operating in total secrecy. But as I watched the live video feeds illuminate the shadows of my home, a cold, hard resolve solidified in my chest. I was done reacting to their betrayal. I had officially started the hunt. I needed more than just observation. I needed undeniable proof of their malicious intent to hand over to the authorities. If they were willing to harm me to inherit my estate, they needed a compelling reason to speed up their timeline. I needed to give them a target so tempting that they would abandon all caution and rush into action. I needed the perfect bait. I opened a new document on my laptop and began meticulously crafting a forged financial record. Using my 4 decades of experience auditing corporate financial statements, I designed a perfect replica of a top-tier bank statement. I formatted the document to show a massive recent liquidation of my long-term mutual fund. The fake statement showed a staggering $1.5 million sitting in liquid, unprotected funds in a standard checking account. To anyone looking, it would appear as though I were preparing for a major cash purchase, leaving the capital completely vulnerable to a quick transfer. This document would seal their fate. I checked the tracking app on my burner phone. Rachel and Derek were still a few miles away, browsing expensive boutiques. I had a narrow, risky window of opportunity. I closed my laptop, grabbed my keys, and sped back to my property. I parked my heavy truck deep in the dense woods behind the estate, ensuring it was completely hidden from the main road. I slipped in through the back door, moving silently through the house I had built with my own hands. I walked straight into my study and fired up my heavy office printer. The machine whirred to life, printing the fake bank statement in crisp, official-looking black ink. I took the warm paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a thick manila folder on my mahogany desk. I intentionally let the top right corner of the document poke out, just enough to clearly display the massive account balance and routing numbers. It was a visual magnet for greedy, desperate eyes. I shut down the printer, left the study, and locked the heavy brass deadbolt. I tugged on the handle to ensure it was secure, then slipped out the back door and headed back to my truck, returning to the motel before they even realized I'd been back. Back in the sterile confines of the motel, I set my tablet on the small desk and prepared for a long night. The sun sank below the tree line, dragging my empty house into deep, menacing shadows. On screen, the high-definition infrared cameras adjusted automatically, rendering the dark rooms in clear, glowing detail. At 8 p.m., the front door finally opened. Rachel and Derek returned, arms laden with expensive shopping bags. They walked through the living room, completely unaware that the hidden lenses were tracking their every move. I watched them eat a lavish dinner and laugh without a care in the world. It was a sickening display of entitlement and deception. They truly believed I was shivering on a cold boat in the Chesapeake Bay, leaving my entire estate completely unguarded. As the long hours ticked by, the house fell into absolute silence. At 10 p.m., they retreated to the guest wing for the night. I didn't leave my uncomfortable chair. My eyes were glued to the live feed of the hallway outside my study. I knew Derek couldn't resist the overwhelming temptation. I knew that locked door was an invitation he simply had to accept. The digital clock on the tablet screen clicked to exactly midnight. The house was shrouded in absolute unbroken stillness. Suddenly a shadow moved at the end of the long hallway. Derek stepped into the frame, dressed entirely in dark clothing. He moved with practiced, deliberate stealth, making no sound as he approached the heavy oak door of my study. Rachel followed right behind him, a small tactical flashlight gripped in her trembling hand. Derek knelt gracefully before the locked brass handle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black leather pouch. He unfolded it slowly to reveal a professional set of steel lock-picking tools. My jaw clenched as I watched my son-in-law skillfully insert the torque wrench into my secure deadbolt. He wasn't just a failing tech entrepreneur struggling with a business loan. He was an experienced, calculated criminal. After less than 30 agonizing seconds, the heavy lock gave a sickening, muffled click. Derek pushed the door open slowly and stepped confidently into my private sanctuary. Rachel slipped in right behind him, closing the door gently to avoid drawing any suspicion. The hidden camera inside my digital clock captured their faces perfectly. They walked straight to the mahogany desk, their eyes scanning my private papers and files. Rachel swept her flashlight beam across the polished surface, and the bright light instantly caught the edge of the manila folder. Derek reached out quickly, pulling the forged bank statement from its place. I stared at the live feed, watching their eyes go wide with absolute shock. They were completely mesmerized by the $1.5 million presented before them. Derek tapped the paper, pointing eagerly at the routing numbers and the massive total. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand, a bright, sinister smile spreading across her face. They began whispering to each other. The sensitive microphone couldn't pick up every word, but their greedy intent was crystal clear. They had found the treasure they were looking for. The bait had been taken, hook, line, and sinker. Now, the final stage of my carefully constructed plan could begin. They had broken into my locked room, and they had found the fake fortune. They were about to make a fatal mistake. I turned up the volume on the tablet, holding the speaker close to my ear. Derek traced the printed ink with his finger, his voice trembling with pure adrenaline. "Look at this, Rachel," he whispered. "It's completely unsecured. If we can initiate a wire transfer first thing tomorrow morning, we'll have enough to pay off the summit fund and disappear forever." Rachel leaned in closer, her eyes glittering with cold malice. "But we have to act fast. He's coming back on Sunday. We need to make sure he takes his new supplement the moment he walks through the front door. Once he has a heart attack, the money is ours." I recorded every syllable, smiling in the darkness of the motel room. My trap had closed perfectly. I sat stiffly in the cheap motel chair. The glowing screen of the tablet illuminated the dark space around me. For a fleeting moment, a wave of profound, painful grief washed over my soul. This was my own flesh and blood, standing in my private sanctuary, plotting to ruin me completely for money. My heart ached physically, and I remembered the little girl who used to hold my hand in the hardware store aisles, marveling at the rows of tools and lumber. I didn't know exactly when that innocent child died, replaced by the calculating, cold-hearted woman currently standing on my screen. But that brief wave of grief evaporated almost as quickly as it had arrived. The sadness was swallowed whole by a cold, radiating fury. My heart turned into absolute ice. I wasn't a grieving father mourning the loss of his family anymore. I was a man fighting for my literal survival, watching two desperate predators seal their own inevitable fate. The hidden camera Jackson installed in the digital clock performed flawlessly. The high-definition infrared feed captured every bead of sweat forming on Derek's forehead and every nervous twitch of Rachel's hands. More importantly, the audio was extremely crisp. The sensitive microphone caught their frantic whispers, broadcasting their darkest secrets directly into my quiet motel room. I leaned in toward the speaker, not wanting to miss a single syllable of their confession. Derek paced back and forth at the edge of my mahogany desk, clutching the forged bank statement as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "We have to do this weekend, Rachel," he urged, his voice trembling with a mix of raw panic and sudden frantic greed. "We can't wait any longer. I owe more than $50,000. You know the truth. We can't keep pretending this is just a minor business setback." Rachel grabbed his arm, her face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. "Keep your voice down," she hissed harshly, glancing at the locked door. "I know what we owe, Derek, but we have to handle this smartly." Derek shook his head violently, running his free hand through his messy hair. "Smart, Rachel? There is no time left for smart," he counted down, the words spilling out frantically. "I owe the Summit Fund $1.2 million. $1.2 million. This isn't a small business loan. It's an illegal, high-leverage margin call from a completely bankrupt cryptocurrency exchange. I borrowed hard cash from the wrong people to cover the margin, thinking the market would rebound. It didn't. The money is gone, evaporated into thin air. And those animals at the Summit Fund don't care about market volatility. They care about their capital, and they care about the massive interest I've been dodging for the last 3 months. I leaned back in my chair, briefly struck dumb by the sheer scale of his stupidity. 1.2 million. The story about 50,000 was a pathetic surface lie meant to get inside my home. He had been gambling with shadows, borrowing massive amounts of illegal cash from dangerous people to play a volatile digital market. He had lost everything, and now he had brought the criminal underworld directly to my front door. "They gave me 10 days, Derek continued, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. 10 days. The man who met me outside the coffee shop last week wasn't a debt collector. He was a collector for the syndicate. He told me that if I don't wire them the full amount by the end of next week, they aren't taking me to court. They're taking me into the woods. They're going to kill me, Rachel. They're going to kill us both, just to make an example out of us for the other debtors. We have nowhere left to run." Rachel let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting back to the fake bank statement on the table. "I know, Derek. I know they'll kill us," she replied, her tone completely devoid of any basic human empathy. "That is exactly why my father has to die first. He's had a long, comfortable life. He has millions just sitting in these accounts doing nothing, while we're facing execution. It's not fair. He owes us. We're his family. He should want to save us." The absolute brazenness of her rationalization made my blood boil. She twisted her own terrifying greed into a sick sense of entitlement. She actually believed I deserved to be murdered, so they could erase the debt created by Derek's massive ego. "I tried to do this the clean way," Rachel argued, her voice carrying a defensive, angry edge. "I went to the bank yesterday. I had the forged authorization papers completely ready. I paid a man $1,000 to forge a notary seal and signature verification. I thought I could just walk into the branch, submit the documents to Sarah, and initiate a $2 million reverse mortgage on the entire estate. I already had the routing numbers. We could have drained the equity out of this house, paid off the summit fund, and been on a plane to Europe by Monday morning. He never would have known until the bank came to foreclose. Derek let out a bitter, resentful snort. But that didn't work, did it? He countered. Your brilliant plan failed. It was that idiot manager, Sarah, Rachel spat, every word dripping with venom. She flagged the notary seal. She claimed it looked suspicious and refused to process the reverse mortgage application. She said she needed my father to appear in person to verify the transaction. If she had just processed those papers, we wouldn't have had to use the supplement. We could have just taken the equity and left him with the debt, but now she's forced our hand. If we don't wire the funds by Thursday, we're dead. We have to use the chemical compound. We have to induce a heart attack before he checks his accounts and sees the mortgage inquiry attempts. Derek nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the numbers printed on my fake bank statement. He tapped the paper repeatedly. Look at this, Rachel. He has $1.5 million sitting in a liquid checking account. It's just sitting there. If he suffers a massive heart attack on Sunday night, you'll be the sole executor of the estate by Monday morning. The will explicitly states that you take over all liquid assets immediately upon his death. We can wire that cash directly to the Summit Fund before the coroner even finishes the report. It's the perfect setup. We just have to make sure he takes his medication. Is there anything specific you would like me to focus on or develop in the next part of this story? I sat in the darkness of the motel room, the recorded conversation echoing in my ears. The puzzle was finally complete. Every jagged, irregular piece had fallen perfectly into place, forming the trap I had spent all night building. I was meant to be sitting in the suffocating silence of the motel, my eyes glued to the glowing tablet screen. The trap had closed, but the sheer venom pouring from the hidden speakers was still almost impossible to fully comprehend. Derek stood rigid by my mahogany desk, his trembling fingers clutching the forged bank statement. The allure of $1.5 million had completely shattered whatever cautious instincts he had left. But the one truly controlling the room was Rachel, my own flesh and blood, the child I had raised with every ounce of love I possessed, paced the Persian rug like a caged predator. Her face, usually so carefully masked with a sweet, innocent expression, was now twisted into a mask of pure malice. The dim light of the study cast harsh shadows across her features, highlighting a cold, calculating darkness I had never seen before. She snatched the fake document from her husband's hand, scanning the impressive numbers with a hungry, desperate intensity. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a chilling certainty. "We don't need the bank anymore. The reverse mortgage is a complete dead end. Sarah made sure of that with her pathetic rules and annoying notary checks. But this," she tapped the paper firmly, "this is fully liquid capital. This is exactly what we need to get the Summit Fund off our backs forever." Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He glanced around the locked study as if expecting the walls to suddenly close in on them. "But how do we get it, Rachel?" he muttered, his voice sharp with panic. "We don't have his account passwords. We don't have his security tokens. We can't just walk into a branch and demand a cashier's check. They already turned you away once. If we push too hard, they'll call the police, and we'll be sitting in a federal prison cell long before the mob finds us." Rachel let out a sharp, condescending laugh that made my stomach physically churn. "We don't need his passwords while he's still breathing. Derek," she said, dripping with cold arrogance. "We just need him gone. Once he's declared dead, the estate automatically passes to me. I'm the sole heir. The bank will have no choice but to grant me immediate executive control over every liquid asset he has." She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. "So tell me now, did you increase his dosage today?" Derek shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the floor. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I swapped the capsules this morning, just like we planned. I put the high concentration dose directly into that fancy silver pillbox you bought." I watched him take it before he left for the bank. He swallowed it down with orange juice. He didn't suspect a thing. Are you absolutely sure it's going to work? Rachel pressed, leaning in closer, her posture aggressively demanding an answer. You promised me this would be clean, Derek. You promised me this wouldn't look like a murder. It's clean, Derek countered, a flicker of defensive edge finally piercing his cowardice. The chemist who sold it to me guaranteed the results. It's a highly specialized synthetic compound. It absorbs directly into the bloodstream, causing a massive, untraceable cardiac arrest. It raises blood pressure so fast that the heart simply stops. He took a heavy dose this morning. At his age, it could happen at any moment. It could have happened on his stupid fishing trip tonight. It could happen the moment he walks back through the front door. But when it happens, any medical examiner in Virginia will just write it off as a tragic natural heart attack. There will be absolutely no chemical residue left for a toxicology screen to find. We are completely safe. I sat in the dark, my breath catching in my throat as I listened to them discuss my impending murder with clinical indifference. They weren't talking about a person. They weren't talking about the father who paid their tuition, funded their lavish wedding, and provided a safe haven during their darkest moments. They were talking about an obstacle, a breathing, living stumbling block, standing between them and a pile of unearned cash. This complete lack of hesitation, this total absence of guilt, was the most chilling aspect of it all. Rachel nodded slowly, a dark satisfaction washing over her face. Good, she said coldly, because we are out of time. The Summit Fund isn't making empty threats. They'll torture you, Derek, and they'll likely torture me too, just to make you watch. We need him dead before Sunday night. Derek wiped his face with trembling hands, his breathing shallow and quick. I know, he stammered. But what if it happens here? What if he drops in the hallway? I was measuring the distance the other night, trying to figure out the angles from his bedroom to the stairs. If he drops in the hallway, the first responders might think it's suspicious. They might ask why he was wandering around. Rachel slapped his shoulder hard, the sudden sound echoing sharply through the hidden microphone. Are you a complete idiot? She hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. Stop being such a pathetic coward. Measuring the hallways, you look like a total fool skulking around with a laser pointer at 3 a.m. If he drops in the hallway, you don't panic. You don't call the ambulance right away. You grab his arms and you drag his heavy body into the master bedroom. You dump him on the mattress to create the illusion that he died peacefully in his sleep. You have to get this money at all costs. Do you understand? If you want to survive the week, you have to be prepared to drag his corpse. Derek winced, nodding submissively under his wife's ruthless command. I understand, he whispered. I'll handle the body. I'll make sure the scene is set perfectly. I gently, deliberately closed my laptop, cutting off the visual feed of the two monsters standing in my study. The silence of the motel room rushed back in, heavy and profound. I leaned my head against the cheap headboard and stared at the water-stained ceiling. I felt a single hot tear slide slowly down my weathered cheek. That was the absolute last tear I would ever shed for Rachel. The daughter I had loved, the girl who used to hold my hand and smile with such vitality, was officially dead. She had been completely consumed by an unimaginable greed, leaving only an empty sociopathic shell wearing her mask. I sat alone in the dark, and that deep heartbreak slowly crystallized into an indestructible, diamond-hard resolve. They thought they had planned the perfect crime. They believed they held all the cards, waiting patiently for my heart to stop so they could feast on my life savings. They were absolutely convinced their fabricated reality was safe, but they didn't know I had obtained the toxicology report. They didn't know I had recorded every syllable of their murder confession, and they had absolutely no idea what kind of storm I was about to unleash upon them. I was no longer a grieving father. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing tablet screen, watching the scene unfold in the study. The initial shock of finding the forged bank statement had faded, replaced by the frenzied, suffocating panic radiating from Derek. He was shaking with nervous energy, running his hands through his hair, pacing the length of the Persian rug. The $1.5 million I dangled before them was a lifeline, but the timeline was a noose slowly tightening around his neck. Rachel stood perfectly still, arms crossed defensively over her chest, watching her husband unravel. The heavy silence between them was charged with unspoken accusations and mounting terror. Derek finally stopped pacing and slammed his fist onto my mahogany desk, the sudden noise causing the audio to pop sharply in my headset. "The chemical's working too slowly, Rachel," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a raw, raspy whisper. "You said it would happen within days. He's taking the powder every morning and he still looks completely fine. He's walking around, driving his truck, going fishing. He isn't slowing down. The mob isn't going to wait for his cardiovascular system to finally fail. They want the money on Thursday. If we can't get full executive control over the estate by Monday morning, we won't have enough time to initiate the wire transfer and settle the international holding accounts." Rachel let out a long, irritated breath, her frustration seeping through the speaker. "I gave him the maximum recommended dosage, Derek," she hissed, leaning over the desk to glare at him. "The chemist specifically warned me that if we put too much in at once, it would leave micromarkers in the hepatic system. A smart medical examiner would flag liver toxicity immediately, and we'd both be facing a murder investigation instead of counting our inheritance. We have to maintain the illusion of a natural cardiac event. We need to keep the entire narrative clean." But Derek shook his head violently, rejecting her logic entirely. "It won't matter if it's clean if we're buried in shallow graves before the weekend is over," he argued desperately. "The Summit Fund operates on a strict schedule. They are cold-blooded and efficient. I got another message on my encrypted phone an hour ago. They're tracking my movements, Rachel. They know exactly where we sleep. We can't rely on slow-acting poison anymore. His heart is clearly stronger than the chemist anticipated. We need a definitive guarantee. We need an immediate, catastrophic event that leaves absolutely no room for survival, and no room for doubt. We need an alternative strategy right now, tonight, before he comes back from that fishing trip." Rachel uncrossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "Then what exactly are you proposing?" she demanded coldly. "You brought this nightmare to our front door. If you have a brilliant solution that speeds up his death without putting us in federal prison, I'm all ears." Derek leaned in closer to her, his eyes darting toward the locked door behind them. "I've been thinking about his commercial construction project," he whispered, his voice trembling with dark excitement. "He's still actively consulting on the new high-rise development downtown, the massive glass and steel tower project on Fifth Avenue." Rachel narrowed her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "What does a construction site have to do with the trouble we're in right now?" she asked dismissively. "Everything," Derek answered, a sinister smile slowly creeping across his face. "You know the protocol. When a building is in the final stages of the structural frame, the upper floors are completely open to the elements. They use temporary safety railings, usually heavy steel brackets, bolted directly into the concrete slab. I've been to that specific site twice this month to bring him lunch. I know exactly how those brackets are secured. They use standard industrial bolts. If someone were to loosen the bolts on a specific railing section on the 20th floor, to the naked eye, the structure would look perfectly secure. But the moment any significant weight leans against it, the entire barrier will collapse completely." Rachel was still digesting the lethal mechanics of his idea. Derek took a deep breath, sketching out the rest of his horrifying trap. "We keep feeding him the synthetic powder," he exclaimed eagerly. "That chemical causes severe dizziness, vertigo, and sudden spikes in blood pressure before the final cardiac arrest hits. I invite him up to the 20th floor to review the perimeter framing. We stand near the edge. The high altitude, the open air, combined with the chemical compound, will trigger a bout of vertigo. He will instinctively reach out to grab the safety railing to steady himself. When he puts his body weight against the loosened brackets, the steel will give way. He will fall 20 stories to the sidewalk below. It's the ultimate tragic accident. An aging contractor lost his balance on a dangerous job site. The police will just rule it a terrible workplace death. The insurance policy pays out immediately, and you inherit the entire estate in an instant. I watched my daughter absorb the horrifying details of this new mechanical assassination plot. For several seconds, her face was completely expressionless. I held my breath, hoping against all reason that this violent, brutal concept would finally shatter her greed and awaken her conscience. Yet Rachel slowly nodded. "The risk is immense," she murmured, her voice steady and calculating, "but it is certainly much faster. Are you absolutely sure you can loosen the bolts without attracting the attention of the site foreman?" Derek nodded enthusiastically, eager to prove his worth. "I can do it with ease," he assured her. "In the early morning hours before the heavy machinery crews arrive, that site is a ghost town. I can handle the hardware in under 5 minutes." A profound chill swept through me, freezing my blood. The calculated cruelty in their conversation was sickening, but what truly stopped my heart was the timeline. With trembling hands, I pulled my planner from my duffel bag and frantically flipped to the coming week. The letters practically leaped off the page, confirming my worst, most immediate fear. I didn't have a week to prepare a counterattack. I didn't even have days. My gaze locked onto the bold ink of my Monday morning itinerary. Tomorrow morning, exactly at 8 a.m., I was scheduled for a full structural inspection of the 20th floor perimeter at the 5th Avenue high-rise project. And on the official calendar, listed as my designated safety escort for the morning inspection, was the name Derek. I was scheduled to walk into his trap in exactly 8 hours. I stared at the screen, watching them finalize my execution plan, realizing that the hunt had accelerated violently. I didn't waste a second. I picked up my phone and dialed Gregory Holt's number. It was well past 1 a.m., a time when most people were fast asleep, but Gregory answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with exhaustion, but the sheer panic in my tone sobered him up instantly. I told him I had the evidence we discussed, but the timeline had changed. They were planning to execute their final act in less than 8 hours. I instructed him to meet me at my corporate office downtown, a building that I owned, and which was protected by my own security detail. I shoved my equipment into the duffel bag, left the motel, and drove focused through the empty streets of Alexandria. When I arrived at the corporate plaza, Gregory was waiting in the lobby, having hastily thrown a trench coat over his pajamas. We rode the private elevator in dead silence straight to the top floor. Once inside my executive suite, the heavy soundproof doors locked securely behind us, and I opened my laptop and connected the tablet. I didn't offer any dramatic opening. I simply hit play, letting the raw, unfiltered evil of my daughter and her husband fill the quiet room. Gregory sat completely rigid in the leather guest chair. The color drained from his face as he listened to Rachel ruthlessly detail her hunger for my death, and Derek enthusiastically outlined the mechanical trap he had set on the 20th floor of the 5th Avenue project. When the video finally ended, a heavy, suffocating silence descended on the office. Gregory removed his silver glasses, rubbing his tired eyes with slightly trembling hands. He had been a prosecutor for over a decade. He had seen the darkest, most depraved corners of human nature. But watching a daughter calmly plot an assassination of her own father for mob money was a massive shock to his legal system. "Harrison," he finally spoke in a low voice, filled with dread, "this is the most cold-blooded, premeditated conspiracy I've ever seen in my entire career. They are actively hunting you." I nodded slowly, turning the laptop screen away. "Then we call the police now," I declared firmly. "We show them this clear recording. We hand over Dr. Aris's toxicology report, and we have them arrested before the sun comes up. I want them in handcuffs, Gregory. I want them off my property tonight." But Gregory shook his head slowly, a grim and apologetic expression settling on his face. "It isn't that simple, Harrison," he explained, leaning forward with his elbows on the polished desk. "The legal system doesn't run on our personal outrage. Yes, this recording is devastating. It perfectly proves conspiracy to commit murder, but building a rock-solid case for conspiracy takes vital time." He continued, "The police need to apply for formal arrest warrants. They need to subpoena bank records to verify the debt to the Summit Fund. They need to dispatch detectives to analyze the audio and coordinate with the district attorney. Furthermore, proving a poisoning conspiracy in court is highly complex. You have the capsules, but they can claim you tampered with them yourself to frame them. If we turn this in now, the police might bring them in for questioning, but any defense attorney can have them out on bail by tomorrow afternoon. They will be free. They will know you're onto them, and they will become even more dangerous. I stared at him, frustration churning in my chest. You're telling me that I have a recording of them plotting to murder me, and the law cannot protect me tonight? I asked, my voice rising in anger. I am telling you that the law requires process, Gregory replied softly. If you want them off your property tonight, if you want to ensure they are denied bail, we need an immediate, undeniable crime to occur. We need a violent felony caught on camera, something that leaves no room for defense strategies. You need a recorded felony assault. If Derek physically attacks you in a fit of unprovoked rage, the police will arrest him on the spot. Combined with his existing financial desperation and the audio we already have, a judge will deny bail. He will be locked up, and Rachel will be exposed as a willing accomplice. I leaned back in my executive chair, digesting the brutal reality of his legal advice. I couldn't wait until morning. I couldn't risk stepping onto that active construction site, hoping to outmaneuver a desperate man 20 stories above the street. The stakes were too high. Derek was 30 years my junior, driven by the sheer terror of a mob deadline. If a physical confrontation occurred on that exposed edge, gravity wouldn't care about my anger. I had to control the environment. I had to pull the battlefield back to my own territory, where I held every advantage. I looked at the laptop monitor, the layout of my study, the hidden cameras, the door locks forming in my mind. A dangerous plan took shape in my thoughts, a reckless gamble that required flawless execution to succeed. If we need a felony assault caught on camera to get them locked up tonight, I said, my voice dropping to an icy tone, then I will give them the opportunity to commit that crime. I'm going back to the estate. Gregory stood up, his eyes widening in panic as he approached the desk. Harrison, no, he pleaded. That is too reckless. You are walking into a house with two people who want you dead. You don't know what Derek will do if he's backed into a corner. I stood up to meet his gaze, standing tall. I know what he'll do, Gregory. He's a coward. He uses poison and loosened bolts because he's afraid of a direct physical confrontation. But if I strip away his options, if I tear down the facade of his safety and trap him in his own lies, his panic will overwhelm his cowardice. He will snap. I'll make sure he does. And when he strikes, my cameras will capture every second of his violence. I packed the tablet back into the heavy duffel bag with sharp, precise movements. I instructed Gregory to drive to the local police precinct and wait in the parking lot. I told him to keep his phone in his hand and wait anxiously for my signal. Once Derek finally took the bait and initiated the attack, I would trigger the emergency alert. Gregory would walk into the station, show the live feed of the assault, and demand an immediate armed police response. No warrants needed, no lengthy investigations, no bail hearings. It would be a brutal, undeniable crime in progress. I stepped out of Corporate Plaza into the cool night, ready to trigger the final trap. The time for passively waiting and observing was over. I was going home to confront the monsters living under my roof. The drive back to the estate was like a surreal journey through the darkest corners of my own mind. The sun had just begun to sink below the tree line, casting a scarlet twilight across the evening sky. I called Gregory on the road to confirm he was in position at the police precinct, waiting for my signal. I parked my heavy truck in the driveway and took one final deep breath to steady my pounding heart. I was about to step onto a battlefield disguised as my own dining room. I grabbed my canvas duffel bag, slumping my shoulders to perfectly impersonate an unsuspecting old man who had just finished a long, exhausting trip. My supposed sea voyage had been forced to end early due to severe engine trouble. I opened the heavy front door and walked slowly into the grand foyer. The house was disturbingly quiet, echoing with a grave-like polished emptiness. I knew Rachel and Derek were in the upstairs suite, making final psychological preparations for my funeral. I walked straight into the formal dining room, scanning the space with tactical precision like a commander. This room was the stage for their destruction, and I needed to control every variable within it. I moved lightly, my boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug. My first priority was to clear the area of potential weapons. Derek was a coward, but a cornered coward with a weapon could cause lethal damage. I opened the mahogany sideboard and methodically removed the heavy silver steak knives, the sharp carving forks, and the crystal ornaments that usually decorated the long table. I locked them securely in the cabinets below and shoved the small brass key into my pocket. The dining table was now completely free of anything sharp or lethal. I set out simple porcelain plates and dull silverware, ensuring the entire setup looked like a perfectly normal family dinner. Next, I turned my attention to the seating arrangements. I sat confidently at the head of the table, establishing my absolute authority in this space. Then, I walked to the right, to the exact spot where Derek usually sat. I pulled his heavy oak chair out just a little, angled at an awkward tilt on the rug. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment, but a crucial tactical advantage. When the conflict erupted, that heavy oak chair would serve as a physical obstacle, momentarily impeding his movement and buying me the precious seconds I needed. With the physical environment set, I turned my attention to the digital trap. I pulled the iPad from my bag and carefully positioned it on the stone fireplace mantel, concealing the small device behind a large decorative vase. The camera lens had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire dining room, clearly capturing the head of the table and Derek's designated seat. I synced the tablet to the secure cloud server, ensuring every second of the recording was instantly uploaded and saved. Once the recording indicator light flickered with a steady green glow, I walked into the kitchen and began preparing a simple dinner. I slow roasted a whole chicken and chopped some fresh vegetables, letting the comforting aromas fill the house and mask the tension radiating from my bones. I poured a glass of iced tea and left my silver pillbox conspicuously on the kitchen island. Right on schedule, I heard heavy footsteps descending the grand staircase. Rachel and Derek walked into the kitchen, freezing in their tracks when they saw me standing by the oven. The sheer shock on their faces gave me immense satisfaction. They hadn't expected me back until Sunday night. My sudden appearance shattered the timeline they had constructed and frayed their fragile nerves. "Dad?" Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a fake gesture of surprise. "We weren't expecting you back so soon. Is everything all right?" I returned a warm, unsuspecting smile and turned off the oven. "Engine trouble," I lied smoothly, carrying the roast chicken toward the dining room. "The boat broke down a few miles offshore, and we had to be towed back to the dock. It ruined the whole weekend, so I just decided to drive home early. Hope you don't mind me interrupting your quiet evening." Derek let out a stiff, unnatural chuckle, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "Not at all, Harrison," he stammered, following me. "We're just glad you made it home safely." We took our seats. I sat at the head of the table, commanding the room. Rachel sat to my left, and Derek walked to the right, adjusting the heavy oak chair exactly as I had anticipated. Before I could serve, Rachel leaned forward, her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with fake sickening concern, "did you remember to take your advanced supplement this morning? You know how important your heart health is, especially after such a stressful day." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the unmarked silver pillbox she'd given me. I flipped the lid, revealing the lethal white capsule resting in the shining metal shell. "Of course, dear," I replied, my voice steady and completely calm. "How could I forget the special medicine my only daughter bought for me?" I picked up the capsule, brought it to my lips, and took a deep drink of iced tea. I made an exaggerated swallowing motion and patted my chest, as if the pill had gone down smoothly. In reality, the capsule was tucked securely in the palm of my left hand, safely hidden from their greedy, watchful eyes. Rachel let out a slow breath, and her shoulders visibly relaxed. A dark, triumphant smile crept across her lips. She glanced at Derek across the table, and the look they exchanged was chilling. It was a look of vicious anticipation. They believed the poison was finally flowing through my veins. They believed the countdown to my death had begun. The atmosphere in the dining room turned thick and heavy, charged with unspoken malice. We began to eat, the clinking of dull silverware echoing in the quiet space. Derek could barely touch his food. His legs shook nervously under the table, his eyes darting toward my chest, waiting for that sudden gasp, the clutching of the heart, the fatal collapse. Rachel sipped her wine, her gaze locked on me like a vulture circling a dying animal. She kept asking how I felt, inquiring if I was experiencing any dizziness or shortness of breath. I played the part perfectly. I chewed slowly, occasionally rubbing my left arm or taking deep, ragged breaths, just to watch their eyes widen with eager expectation. They sat in my house, eating my food, actively waiting for my heart to stop so they could steal my life's work to pay off the mob. The total depravity of their souls was on full display under the dining room chandelier. But as the seconds ticked by and my heart continued to beat, with a strong, steady rhythm, their victorious smiles began to waver. Anticipation twisted into confusion, and confusion quickly curdled into raw panic. Their execution deadline was approaching. I watched the blood drain from Derek's face as the minutes passed. He stared fixedly at my chest, waiting for a fatal collapse that wasn't coming. Rachel gripped the stem of her wine glass so hard her knuckles turned white. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was time. I wiped my mouth slowly with my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my plate. I looked directly at my daughter, shedding the mask of the naive, easygoing father. I reached into the chest pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out the thick black envelope with silver lettering. I tossed it across the smooth mahogany table. It landed with a soft thud directly onto Derek's roasted chicken. "Apex funding," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. Derek recoiled, his chair screeching against the Persian rug. He stared at the ominous black envelope as if it were a venomous snake coiled on his dinner plate. Before either of them could organize a denial, I reached into the bag at my feet. I pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents held by a heavy brass clip. I slid them across the table until they tapped against Rachel's wine glass. Rachel looked down at the official seal on the first page, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "What is this, Dad?" she stammered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. I leaned forward, bracing my forearms on the table. "I know everything," I declared coldly, my gaze shifting between the two monsters sitting in my home. "I know about the $1.2 million debt to the mob, Derek. I know about the massive margin call you lost on illegal crypto. I know the collectors gave you 10 days or they would bury you both in the woods." Derek began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to process how his darkest secret had been dragged into the light. "And you, Rachel," I continued, turning my focus to my own flesh and blood. "I know all about the poison. I know about the synthetic chemical compound you put in the silver pillbox. I know you tried to induce a fatal cardiac arrest so you could inherit this estate and pay off your husband's gambling debts." The room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, fabricated lie, but the weight of my knowledge shattered her words before they could escape her throat. She slumped in her chair, stunned by the horrifying reality that her perfect assassination plot had been fully unmasked. I slowly stood from the head of the table, looking down on them with the true, absolute authority of decades. "You thought I was an ignorant old man," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. "You thought you could get rid of me and steal my life savings to save yourselves, but you underestimated me. I spent the day with my legal team. I have moved all my assets, this estate, and every cent of liquid capital in my name, into an irrevocable charitable trust. You get nothing, Rachel. You have been completely disinherited, and you have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before the mob finds you." The impact of my words hit them with the force of a physical blow. The illusion of their impending wealth vanished instantly, leaving only the terrifying reality of their demise. Rachel leaped from her chair, her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure hatred. The act of the sweet, loving daughter was gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You can't give our money to charity. That money belongs to us." I watched her with deep disgust. "It's my money, Rachel. It's every cent I earned through 40 years of backbreaking labor, while you sat comfortably waiting for the world to be handed to you on a silver platter." Rachel slammed her fists onto the dining table, knocking over her wine glass. A pool of deep red liquid spilled across the polished wood, dripping onto the rug like blood. "You're so selfish!" she shrieked. The raw venom in her voice exposed the true depth of her sociopathy. "You have millions just sitting in bank accounts doing nothing. We're your family. We're facing execution. You should be happy to save us. You're a horrible, miserable old man, and you deserve to die." I stood still, completely unmoved by her vicious outburst. "You stopped being my family the moment you handed me that poison-filled capsule," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "You made your choice, Rachel. Now you have to live with the lethal consequences. Your 5 minutes are ticking. Pack everything you can take and get off my property immediately, because the second that clock strikes the hour, I'm calling the police." While Rachel unleashed her horrific, self-righteous fury, Derek sat frozen in his seat. His eyes were wide, fixed on the black envelope resting on his plate. The reality of his situation finally hit his cowardly shoulders with devastating force. The $1.5 million bait I dangled was gone. The irrevocable trust meant he had no path left to steal my wealth. He was a dead man, and he knew it. The people at Apex Funding were tracking him. They were waiting for their money, and they wouldn't accept failure. Derek slowly raised his head, his gaze shifting from the black envelope to my face. A terrifying, primitive panic began to replace the cowardice in his eyes. The rational part of his brain, the part that calculated risks and measured hallways in the dead of night, completely shut down. He was no longer a calculating con artist. He was a trapped beast fighting for his literal survival. "You framed us," he muttered, his voice dropping to a guttural, dangerous growl. "You knew everything, and you let us believe we had a chance. You led us into this trap." I stared him down, refusing to look away. "I just let you walk straight into your own trap, Derek," I declared firmly. "Now get out of my house." Derek stood up slowly, his body trembling with a violent, explosive energy. He looked at the lock cabinet where I kept my sharp cutlery. He looked at the heavy oak chair I had deliberately angled from the table. The only way he was getting out of this alive was to remove the man standing in front of him. I needed him to take that final step. I needed the felony assault caught perfectly on the hidden cameras, recording this room from every angle. I deliberately stepped closer to him, shortening the distance and challenging his fragile masculinity. "Are you going to poison my food next, Derek?" I taunted, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Are you going to try and loosen the safety railings on the 20th floor again tomorrow morning? You're a pathetic, miserable failure. You couldn't even execute a simple murder. You botched the whole plan." That was the final spark needed to ignite his volatile temper. Derek let out a primitive, desperate roar of pure rage. He lunged across the dining table, ignoring the spilled wine and scattered porcelain. He swung his fists wildly, aiming a heavy, desperate blow directly at my jaw. I'm older, but I was prepared. I stepped back quickly, letting his momentum carry him forward. His foot caught the leg of the heavy oak chair I had placed at that specific angle. Derek stumbled violently, losing his balance completely. He slammed into the edge of the table, but the raw adrenaline kept him moving. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a murderous frenzy, and lunged for me again. He tackled me around the waist, his massive momentum pushing us both backward. With a dull thud that rattled my bones, we slammed into the stone fireplace mantel, right in front of the hidden camera. I felt his hands tighten around my neck, his thumbs pressing cruelly into my windpipe, trying to snuff out my life right there on the floor. The trap was set, and the predator had taken the bait completely. My equipment was uploading this violent assault directly to the protected server. I fought back to ensure my victory. I drove my knee upward with every ounce of strength I had, catching him squarely in the chest. The sudden impact broke his vicious grip. I gasped for air, crawling backward across the polished hardwood floor, widening the gap between us. Derek stumbled, his breathing becoming heavy and desperate. His eyes were completely wild, stripped of all rational thought, and consumed entirely by the feral instinct to eliminate the threat standing between him and survival. He looked around the room, his frantic gaze falling on the heavy, solid oak chair I had deliberately pulled out earlier. With a guttural scream that echoed off the high ceiling, he hoisted the massive piece of furniture into the air. He didn't hesitate. He swung the solid wood directly at my head with lethal, uncontrolled force. I could have avoided the flying projectile entirely. My reflexes were sharp enough to duck safely, but I needed this visual evidence to be absolutely unassailable. I needed this felony assault to be so violent and so blatant that no defense attorney in this state could argue it was self-defense or an accidental scuffle. I steadied myself and deliberately shifted my weight, leaning slightly forward into the path of the heavy oak. The thick wooden leg grazed my forehead, delivering a brutal blow. The sound of the impact was deafening, and a wave of white-hot, blinding pain shot through my skull. My vision flashed with harsh, blinding light, and I crashed backward onto the rug. I felt the skin split immediately. A thick, hot stream of blood ran down my cheek, blurring my left eye and dripping onto my crisp collar. It was a terrifying, calculated risk, but that searing pain confirmed the trap had closed flawlessly. The camera had just recorded a decisive, undeniable felony assault. I struggled to my feet, bracing myself against the mantel, and bolted out of the dining room before Derek could recover. I ran down the hallway, leaving a trail of blood behind me, and dove into the master bathroom, slamming the heavy oak door. I threw the deadbolt just as Derek threw his full weight against the wood. The solid door frame shuddered under the violent impact. "Open the door!" he screamed, his voice reaching a pitch of hysterical, homicidal rage. Seconds later, Rachel joined him, her fists pounding mercilessly against the obstacle. "You're not getting away with this!" she shrieked, her voice stripped of any remaining pretense. Their desperate, violent pounding echoed in the small space, but I ignored them entirely. I reached into my pocket and with blood-stained fingers pulled out my phone and sent a single text to Gregory Holt, who was waiting at the station. Phase 1 complete. I grabbed a white towel from the shelf and pressed it firmly against the deep gash on my forehead to stop the bleeding. I didn't wait for them to break the door down. I unlocked the frosted glass window above the garden tub, pushed the heavy pane outward, and slipped silently into the cool night air. The drop to the soft mulch below was short. I landed gracefully and vanished into the shadows. I moved quickly to my truck parked near the side door, started the engine, and drove straight to the hospital emergency room. As the adrenaline slowly faded and only a dull throbbing remained, the flashing neon lights of the medical center guided my way. Under the sterile, bright lights of the trauma unit, doctors rushed over to clean and stitch the deep laceration above my eyebrow. While the medical staff worked, my phone began vibrating incessantly with updates from Gregory. By the time I was sitting under the surgical lights, a fully armed tactical SWAT team had already violently breached the front door of my estate. Gregory had walked directly into the precinct, presented the cloud-synced high-definition footage of the brutal assault, and demanded immediate action. The video of Derek hurling a massive piece of solid wood furniture at an unarmed old man was undeniable. The police didn't need months to build a conspiracy case. They were facing a bloody, violent felony in progress. The tactical team swarmed the dining room, pinning Derek to the floor before he even realized the nightmare had officially arrived. Rachel was handcuffed to the kitchen granite, screaming and crying as the police read them their rights. But the real brilliance of the raid was in the follow-up search. Once authorities secured the scene, they systematically inventoried the items my daughter and son-in-law had hastily packed in their panic. In Rachel's designer handbag, detectives found the brand-new silver pillbox containing the concentrated synthetic poison. The chemical matched the description detailed in the recorded conversation perfectly. In Derek's leather briefcase, they discovered the forged bank statements and the fake legal documents he had attempted to use to seize my corporate assets. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and perfectly packaged. Just as the doctor was applying the final bandage to my head, Gregory arrived at the ER. He walked into my bay, his exhausted face wearing a grim but extremely satisfied expression. "They are in custody, Harrison," he confirmed in a low voice, pulling up a chair beside my bed. The DA was absolutely stunned by the sheer volume of evidence we handed them on a silver platter. The district attorney is moving forward with a full suite of harsh charges. They have officially charged Derek with first-degree felony assault, attempted murder, and massive financial fraud. Rachel is facing the same charges of conspiracy and attempted murder for her role in the poisoning plot. The video of the assault, combined with the physical poison and the staggering financial motive, painted a picture so evil that the presiding judge didn't even hesitate during the emergency arraignment. He denied bail for both of them entirely, citing they were a severe flight risk and a direct danger to the community. They were locked in separate concrete cells at the county detention center, stripped of their expensive clothes and arrogant delusions. In the span of a single night, they had lost their freedom, their wealth, and their future. But the legal justice system was only the first layer of the destruction they were about to face. The truly terrifying consequence of their failure arrived shortly before dawn. Word traveled extremely fast through the criminal underworld, and the gangsters at the Summit Fund were notoriously well connected. As soon as the morning news broadcast the dramatic arrest of the disgraced businessman, Derek and his co-conspirator wife, those ruthless collectors knew exactly where to find him. Derek was no longer a moving target under the false protection of my estate. He was a sitting duck in an overcrowded county jail. The $1.2 million he owed them was completely unrecoverable, and the mob didn't simply write off bad debts. They demanded immediate, violent retribution. Hours after they were booked, Gregory received a reliable tip from an informant within the prison system. The word had reached the leaders of the prison gangs. Derek was marked. He wasn't going to make it through the week. 2 months have passed since that long, bloody night. I sit alone on the back porch, watching the golden sun slowly sink below the tree line. The air is crisp and cool, and this estate is finally wrapped in a deep, indestructible silence. I lift my hand, gently touching the small, pale scar that has just healed above my eyebrow. It is a permanent physical mark, a reminder of the exact price I had to pay to survive. The heavy oak door behind me opens with a soft click, but there is no tightness in my shoulders anymore. The phone on the small rattan table rings. It is a brief, satisfying call from Gregory Holt. With a sense of cold, professional pride, he informs me that Rachel and Derek officially accepted their plea deals this morning. To avoid facing a jury trial, they both signed agreements to spend the next 15 years in federal prison. The mountain of digital and physical evidence we presented was completely insurmountable. They will be locked in concrete cells for the next decade and a half, stripped of their lavish delusions and toxic greed. Derek will never have to face the wrath of the Summit Fund on the outside, but for a man as cowardly as him, the prison itself carries a brutal punishment. I hang up the phone and pour myself a small glass of aged bourbon. The amber liquid warms my throat, soothing the last lingering shadows of the past. I walk down the wooden steps and stroll toward the edge of the vibrant garden. Martha always loved these hydrangeas. Last week I had the entire bed completely replanted, restoring the vibrant blues and purples to their original breathtaking splendor. I take a deep, steady breath, inhaling the sweet floral scent mixed with the evening dew. Sometimes, to effectively excise a terminal cancer, you must be fully prepared to let yourself bleed a little. The wound was deep, but the infection has been permanently cleared. Standing in my beautiful, quiet, and perfectly protected private sanctuary, I can finally breathe easily, standing strong and secure. Family is not just defined by blood. It is defined by respect, loyalty, and basic human decency. When those who share your DNA choose pure greed over your life, you owe them absolutely nothing. We are taught to sacrifice endlessly for our children, but true wisdom is knowing when to stop being a victim. Do not let emotional blackmail trap you in a toxic, dangerous environment. Protect your peace, protect your legacy, and never underestimate how far a desperate person will go. You have the absolute right to defend your own life, even if the enemy sleeps at the end of the hallway. If this incredible story kept you on the edge of your seat, please like and subscribe. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments below and let me know where you are watching from today.